Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan and I feel pretty COVID-free finally. I think I've fully recovered, which is great news. Anyway, the Star Wars universe is no stranger to taking elements from our own world and incorporating it into the lore. The tactics of the Rebel Alliance, for instance, demonstrate a fascinating mix of insurgent tactics that are heavily inspired by those employed in the Indochina Wars or the Vietnam Wars. And this is not surprising considering the fact that George Lucas, the creator, has stated he wanted to create parallels between a primitive species fighting against a technologically superior empire. But the comparisons between the Galactic Civil War and the Indochina and Vietnam Wars go way beyond just the surface level. Let's take a look. The tactics of an insurgency are created out of necessity and desperation. An insurgency is defined by their inability to field a proper army that can defeat the enemy on the open field of battle. Therefore, insurgents must rely on a hit-and-run strategy, public support, and acceptance of horrendous casualties. Further support from another nation for weapons is not required, but a big benefit as well. Now, the problem with foreign support is eventually it will try to turn the insurgency into a puppet for its own interests. This is exactly what happened to the Rebel Alliance and also the Viet Minh. Although they were initially created and supported by friendly foreign interests, these factions eventually would turn against their creators. The Viet Minh was created with a mix of American and Soviet backing following the Japanese conquest of the French colony of Indochina in 1941, which is now modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Following World War II, the territory was returned to France in hopes of preventing a French post-war collapse and preventing a communist revolution in France. The Americans therefore abandoned their anti-colonial policy and left the Viet Minh to be annihilated by French forces. The Viet Minh, holding their goal of Vietnamese independence, continued their fight and repurposed the tactics they used against the Japanese against the French Empire. The birth of the Rebel Alliance army can be traced to the Endorian partisans, led by Saw Gerrera. They were trained by Republic operatives and Jedi to fight against the Separatists during the Clone Wars. Following the reorganization of the Republic into the Galactic Empire, the Endorian rebellion continued their fight against the Empire, who refused to honor their independence. The tactics the partisans used against the Separatists were repurposed against the Empire, with their ranks rapidly swelling into a credible early threat against Imperial rule. The use of hit-and-run attacks against convoys, while using the planet's heavy jungle environments to neutralize the Empire's air superiority, were hallmarks of their tactics. The early work of the Viet Minh forces were just as extreme as the partisans' early actions. The Viet Minh, using the vast jungles of Vietnam and mountainous terrain, moved into ambush positions and annihilated French convoys on the regular. The French were not well suited for this type of warfare and were forced to send out patrols and strike forces to find the enemy deep in the jungle. They would oftentimes, of course, get ambushed by Vietnamese guerrillas. The Viet Minh, like the rebels, used the vastness of their territory to prevent the detection of their bases by hiding them deep within jungle and cave systems. The French and later the Americans saw the problems of attacking seemingly never-ending Vietnamese bases without gaining any progress in the war at all. The Viet Minh fought with a very pragmatic doctrine, which basically did not include any heavy equipment because they were hard to move within the jungle. The limited heavy equipment they did possess were all designed to be broken down so that they could be carried by hand over narrow mountain passes. The overall unpopularity of French rule meant that the Viet Minh did not need to hold much territory, they just needed to have their presence felt constantly. If the Viet Minh could win the occasional victory, no matter how minor, the French's principal weapons of fear and legitimacy would be defeated. The increasing French retaliation against the local innocent Vietnamese population was further decreasing their ability to maintain control over the country. The ability for the Empire to seemingly overrun a rebel base time and time again without changing the course of war was another defining characteristic of the Galactic Civil War. The rebels did not need to hold territory, but rather made the Empire bleed before proceeding to withdraw and repeat the process. The rebels, due to their small bases and lack of heavy equipment like walkers, were able to relocate their entire base by the time the Empire usually arrived. The rebellion would oftentimes leave rearguard forces that were intended to delay the Empire from destroying their evacuation. Over the course of the Galactic Civil War, the Empire rarely had an opportunity to completely destroy a rebel base before they were able to evacuate. The hit-and-run tactics used by the rebellion also occasionally resulted in defeats that undermined the Empire's ability to instill fear. The early attacks on Scarif and the Jeddah insurgency achieved very little of greater military value, but show that the Empire did not have the ability to prevent rebel attacks. The inability to maintain that credible sense of fear in the native population of the Outer Rim, coupled with the overall brutality of Imperial rule, made any rebel victory impactful. Both the rebellion and the Vietnam would eventually achieve victories that were massive and almost improbable to their enemies. The rebellion achieved their key victory against the Empire with the destruction of the Death Star. The Empire's principal tool of fear had been defeated, and the rebellion had gained a critical propaganda victory. The Viet Minh's Death Star equivalent came at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The air base at Dien Bien Phu was the main base for French operations in the northwest part of the country. The Viet Minh were able to take the high ground around the air base, envelop it, and then bombard it into submission with artillery emplacements, followed by an all-out infantry assault. Eventually, the French perimeter collapsed under the pressure, and the Viet Minh took over 12,000 French prisoners, which of course shocked the world. With the destruction of the French airbase at Dien Bien Phu, their ability to send counterinsurgent forces against the Viet Minh was completely gone. The French would agree to concessions and formally grant independence to the Vietnamese under the Geneva Accords. This independence, however, divided Vietnam into two separate countries. You had a northern regime, which was communist-backed, and a western regime in the south. The similarities between the Vietnam War and the Galactic Civil War do not end there. The importance of the Vietnam War on American culture is hard to understand today given the commonality of American anti-insurgency actions. The perception of technologically inferior forces defeating the most advanced nation on Earth was hard to reconcile at the time, despite it having some precedents in our own history when American militias were able to defeat the British Army during the American Revolution. But at the time, in the 60s and 70s, the perception of a technologically inferior force defeating the most advanced nation on Earth was hard to reconcile. The experience of American veterans and the reputation of the Viet Cong, a successor of the Viet Minh operating in South Vietnam, further influenced the overall perception of the war. Despite not having served in Vietnam himself because of medical reasons, George Lucas was very much a part of the Vietnam generation and was very affected by this conflict. The cultural impact of Vietnam therefore came directly into representation during the Battle of Endor. The Ewoks, despite looking smaller in stature and unassuming compared to the rebel and imperial forces, demonstrated a tenacious ferocity that rivaled both sides. The Ewoks, with little more than spears, interconnected tree houses, booby traps, and ferocity, arguably had more influence on the rebel victory on Endor than the rebels. The Viet Cong, an insurgent force that operated in South Vietnam, often used outdated bolt-action rifles or cheap Soviet small arms, which were often viewed as archaic to American forces. The jungle fighting also made hand-to-hand combat a common occurrence, with rifles reduced to being little more than spears or clubs in those tight quarters. The Ewoks used simple primitive traps that were able to destroy state-of-the-art Imperial AT-STs and impaled stormtroopers with terrifying spike traps. The Viet Cong also routinely used bamboo traps functioning similar to bear traps or punji stick pits to impale American patrols with bamboo spikes covered in human feces. In both cases, the Viet Cong and Ewok weapons and tactics were considered obsolete, but did considerable damage against far more technologically superior forces of the Empire and America. The Ewoks lived in an interconnected treehouse network that also oddly mirrored the tunnel networks of the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army used vast tunnel networks that were often dug no bigger than 2 feet wide by 4 feet high to perform ambushes on American forces. The verticality of the above-ground tree networks and the underground tunnel networks allowed these insurgent forces in both cases to travel unharassed and out of sight of the enemy's heavy weapons, creating unique opportunities for ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. The poor nutrition of the average Viet Cong fighter also allowed them to fit more easily in these tunnels when compared to their American soldier counterparts, thus drawing a direct if not insulting comparison between the Ewoks and the Viet Cong. but it was the 80s, and I guess things like that were acceptable back then. The perception that it was impossible for America to lose in Vietnam is also mirrored by the Imperial survivors, who were largely confounded by their defeat at the hands of sentient teddy bears. The harsh resistance that the Empire experienced all over the Outer Rim further shook the belief and resolve of these Imperial soldiers. The latter actions of the Empire, like the destruction of Alderaan, were so shocking that even many stormtroopers who were the most indoctrinated and loyal Imperial soldiers were beginning to question the actions of the Empire. This disenchantment was also mirrored by the American soldiers involved in Vietnam, who started questioning what the point of this very devastating conflict was. The losses in the war further added to the sense of disenchantment, as between 1 to 3.8 million Vietnamese, 50,000 Americans, 5,000 South Koreans, 1,000 Canadians, and 500 Australians all died for this conflict. The last comparison we really want to make between the Galactic Civil War and the Vietnam War is the treatment of prisoners, directly the treatment of prisoners by the Viet Cong and the Ewoks. The Ewoks are shown eating captured Imperials and using their armors as trophies. This might serve as a metaphor for the terrible treatment that American POWs underwent when they were captured by either the Viet Cong or the NVA. Many captured Americans were executed, lynched, or sent to prisoner of war camps where many died of starvation. Former American POWs have described the imprisonment as worse than death, and the details are probably too brutal for YouTube. And lastly, we have to talk a little bit about George Lucas's political views on the war. Although George Lucas has never expressed publicly socialist or communist sympathies, he has expressed a non-interventionist perspective on American international policy. And so it kind of makes sense that he would draw these comparisons between the Vietnam War and the Battle of Endor and the Galactic Civil War. But let me know in the comment section below what you guys think. What kind of comparisons do you see being made in Star Wars when it comes to the Rebels and the Empire? Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.